My name is Clara Hensley. I am 63 years old, retired from a small-town library in Ohio. I spent most of my life shelving other people's stories, never realizing how quietly mine had been rewritten by the people I loved most. That morning, I was in the kitchen, dusting flour from my hands, rolling dough for the same Sunday biscuits my husband once adored. The house smelled of butter and cinnamon. Outside, snow was melting off the porch rails. Inside, the quiet broke with a voice that didn't belong to the boy I raised. From the living room, my son said, "Sweetheart, use Mom's card. She's got about 130,000 saved." His tone was casual. Confidence. Like he was talking about some public fund, not the savings I'd scraped together from 40 years of double shifts and unclaimed vacation days. I froze. My hands, still dusted in flour, hovered over the dough as if a single breath could ruin it. Through the open doorway, I heard Elena, his wife, laugh softly, a light, practiced laugh that always sounded more like approval than joy. She asked, "Are you sure, Mark? That's a lot." And my son, my only child, said the words that hollowed me out. "Of course I'm sure. She never says no. She owes us for letting her stay here. Let me stay here, in my own house." The rolling pin slipped, hit the counter, and rolled to the floor with a sound that felt too loud for that moment. My heart thudded in its place, steady but foreign. I didn't walk in there. I didn't shout or correct him. I just stared at the small crack running through the kitchen tile, one he'd made years ago dropping his backpack after high school football practice, and thought, when did the floor beneath us change like this? From the front hallway came the jingle of Elena's purse and the soft click of the door. Through the window, I saw her walk to her car, sunlight flashing off the windshield as she pulled away. Later, I would learn she went straight to the mall. She filled her cart with the glittering kind of things she always said belonged to a better life: electronics, clothes, imported perfumes. She even bought Mark a smartwatch. When she reached the counter, the cashier smiled and said, "That'll be $82,000, ma'am." Elena handed over my card, my name still shining across the front, and the machine beeped. The cashier frowned, tapped a few keys, and said the line that would echo in my head for days. "Sorry, but this card is..." A pause. "Declined." Somewhere across town, as the screen flashed red, I was standing in my kitchen staring at that same card number printed on an old receipt. I already knew it wouldn't go through, because 20 minutes earlier, when Mark's words reached me like a knife wrapped in silk, I had picked up the phone, pressed the worn numbers of my bank, and said quietly, "Hi, I'd like to freeze my account." No trembling, no hesitation. Just a kind of calm that only comes after you've been unseen for too long. I remember the operator asking if the card was lost or stolen, and I said, "Neither. It's being used without permission." Then I placed the phone down, wiped my hands on my apron, and looked around the kitchen that had once been mine in every sense. There was the ceramic rooster I'd bought when Mark was born, the clock that always ticked 3 minutes fast, the photo of us, his graduation day, his arm around me, his eyes full of the boy I still remembered. I picked up the rolling pin and set it upright, as if that tiny act could steady me, and maybe it did. Because when Mark's car pulled into the driveway later that afternoon, tires crunching hard on gravel, I didn't feel fear or fury, only an extraordinary stillness. He burst into the kitchen, face flushed. "Mom, why did you block the card? Elena's at the store. She couldn't pay." I turned to him, wiped the flour from my palms, and said simply, "Because it's mine." For a long second, neither of us spoke. Only the clock ticked between us, loud and honest. He looked at me like I was the problem to solve, like I had broken some invisible rule that had always kept our family in balance. But balance built on silence was never real. That was the moment I realized I had raised a son who had forgotten who built the ground he stood on. And I also realized something else. That day, the woman he thought was too quiet to notice finally had. I did not learn to be quiet in one day. It was practiced the way bread dough is kneaded, fold by fold. After the card was declined and Mark's anger cooled into a passing weather, my mind walked backward on its own. It led me through the rooms I had lived in and the years I had worn thin, and it stopped at the small rental where we first started. The carpet was the color of oatmeal. The walls smelled faintly of bleach. I can still feel the chill of that winter as I stood at the sink, steaming breath rising, wrists in dishwater that would not turn warm. I cleaned houses by daylight. I learned other women's cupboards by heart. I lined their spices to the same angle and buffed their faucets until they copied my face. Tips were folded into 20s or 5s. I kept the small bills under a clip, pressed flat, kissed by lemon cleaner. When I paused to drink water, the clock on their microwaves shone a green number that did not belong to me. I would run a finger across the edge of a marble island and think, careful, careful, leave no trace but shine. At night, I hemmed and mended. I knew a family's secrets by their cuffs, grass stains that never left, a loose thread on a christening dress, the neckline a daughter wanted higher. I stitched on the kitchen table with a lamp turned low while Mark did homework beside me. When the needle snagged, I breathed and tried again. The rhythm soothed him. Sometimes he fell asleep on my arm and I shifted the fabric so I would not wake him. I told myself that careful work is a kind of prayer. If you do it long enough, someone you love might stay safe. Back then, my husband, Daniel, was still home, a tall shadow whose lungs carried a soft rattle. He was kind in the way a quiet lake is kind, steady, a little distant, true. Illness arrived without apology. We measured our days in inhalers and copay envelopes. I drove him to the clinic between shifts, counting the pharmacy receipts with the same pinched care I used for thread. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he could not. He died in late October that smelled like apples and damp leaves. The world went on throwing color as if it did not know. I learned how to hold grief and groceries in the same hands. The week after the funeral, I returned to the houses and the sewing, because rent dates do not move for sadness. I kept my hair tied back and my head down. I started bringing a thermos of tea because coffee felt too sharp. That was when I reached for the one thing of my mother's I had not sold or given away, a small ivory-glazed teapot crazed along the lid from age. When steam rose from its mouth, I could hear the kitchen of my childhood, my mother's voice asking if I needed another blanket, the smell of toast, and a clean floor. Every cup of tea carried one more compromise I never mentioned. I would pour. I would think about the extra shift I had accepted. I would think about the school trip Mark wanted. I would swallow and the heat would decide for me. The pot traveled with me the way people carry faith, wrapped in a towel inside my tote, set quietly by the sink while I scrubbed other sinks. The handle wore smooth where my thumb rested. Each nick on its rim marked a month we made it. Money grew in uneven rows, like a backyard garden. I set a rule that every paycheck owed the future a small tithe, 5% at first, then more. I opened an account the bank teller called a nest egg. I smiled at the phrase and did not mention that some eggs never hatch. I kept ledgers in a school notebook, additions and subtractions like a private algebra. On nights when the math leaned toward red, I hemmed prom dresses for cash. On mornings when a client canceled, I clipped coupons and made soup from bones. There were bright days, too. Mark at 10 with a paper crown from a fast food birthday, the two of us laughing, grease on our fingers, the sun cutting stripes across the table. A Saturday in June when Daniel felt strong enough for the farmer's market. He held a tomato like a stone from a holy river. The first snowfall each year, soft and slow. I always walked outside to listen, because snow hushes even the hard city. I did not live an unloved life. I lived a life that asked for steady hands. As Mark grew, he began to collect a world I could not see, coaches and friends and the sparkling tilt of other houses. I did not begrudge him new doors. I only hoped he would remember who fixed the hinge on the old one. When college brochures arrived, I pressed my palm to the stack as if warmth could become a grant. We did what families do. We made do. I took on a second ladder of houses and let the sewing run until midnight. I learned which fabrics sang under the needle and which fought back. I learned that hunger loosens its hold if you boil rice with a bay leaf. There were men who asked me to smile more. There were women who pressed a hand to my arm and said thank you with such sincerity that I felt tall all afternoon. I saved their notes. I kept them in a blue envelope with the bank statements. Proof that I had not been invisible to everyone. Years layered themselves like quilts. The apartment turned into a house. Then the house turned into a calculation. When Daniel was gone and Mark almost grown, I sold the first place to lift us to the next, because stairs are kinder than sinking. No one accused me of sacrifice. I did not use the word. I called it a step and kept walking. By the time Mark married Elena, the savings had reached a number that looked like safety. I told no one. I protected it the way you protect a weak flame in wind. Body curved around, hand cupped, eyes alert. I believed that a small, sure future was something I could build. Not grand, not famous, but ours. If I had known how easily gratitude can be mistaken for permission, I might have practiced a louder kind of love. Instead, I brewed tea, I counted, I stitched names into labels so clothes would not be lost at school. I reinforced knees on work pants and buttonholes on church shirts. I kept the world from unraveling where I could reach it. The rest unraveled anyway. All of that lives inside me when I stand in the kitchen now, hands flower white, listening to my son measure my life in numbers. He is not a villain. He is a man raised in a country that praises what shines. I am not a saint. I am a woman who kept receipts. The teapot sits on the stove, warm to the touch. When I lift it, the lid rattles a little, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. I pour, and the steam rises. I breathe it in and let the years settle. Then I wipe the counter to a clean line and prepare to turn the key that will change the locks none of them can see. The small changes came quietly, as they often do. At first it was Elena offering to help with the bills. She had that cheerful tone that made refusal sound ungrateful. "I'll take care of the utilities, Clara," she said one morning, waving her phone like a flag of progress. "It's easier to keep track if everything's under one login." I wanted to say, "I've been keeping track since before you knew how to balance a checkbook," but I didn't. I only nodded, grateful in the polite way women of my generation are taught to be. The word grateful is a leash we learn to wear early. Soon after, she started changing how the kitchen ran. My labels disappeared from the pantry. The teapot moved to the far shelf, hidden behind her French press and jars of imported beans. She began buying things in bulk, the kind of glossy brands that promise success on their packaging. When I asked if we could keep the old tea I liked, she smiled thinly. "That brand smells old-fashioned. Let's try something fresher." So I stopped asking. I drank my tea in the mornings when she wasn't awake, listening to the house breathe differently. The walls felt tighter. Even the air had a new rhythm. Elena's rhythm, sharp and efficient. One afternoon, I found her sitting at the dining table with my bank statement open on her tablet. The numbers glowed like secrets in plain sight. "Oh," she said, startled but not ashamed. "Mark told me to look over the savings, just to make sure it's invested properly." I stared at her, at those long, manicured fingers scrolling through decades of my labor, and I felt a strange calm spread through me, like cold water running under a locked door. "Invested," I repeated. My voice didn't sound like mine. She nodded, bright as ever. "You could be earning interest. Money shouldn't just sit there." I wanted to ask how she defined earning, but I only said, "Thank you for caring," because old habits die harder than pride. At dinner that week, the shift became official. We sat at the long oak table I'd once polished every Sunday. Elena said it now, linen napkins, flickering candles, her favorite white wine. I noticed how the dishes had changed. Store-bought lasagna, a glass salad bowl that sparkled like her engagement ring. Mark poured wine into her glass first, then into his, and only after a pause, into mine. A small pause, but enough. Elena smiled across the table. "You're lucky we took you in, Clara," she said lightly, cutting her food. "Living alone at your age can be so isolating." Her words slid out smooth, practiced, coated in sugar, but they landed like stones. I looked at her, really looked. The perfect hair, the gleaming ring, the way she leaned into my son as if ownership were a form of affection. And then I smiled back. Polite, slow, deliberate. I reached for the teapot and poured myself a cup. Steady hand, quiet breath. Lucky, I said softly. Yes, I suppose I am. Mark didn't look up. He was scrolling his phone, half listening. Elena's right, Mom. It's good you're not by yourself. I took a sip of tea. The steam brushed my face like a small ghost. The taste was faintly bitter, too new, too foreign. But I swallowed it anyway. That night, I washed the dishes while they watched a show in the living room. Their laughter echoed through the hallway, bright and private. As I dried the plates, I noticed Elena's lipstick stain on one of the glasses, red against crystal, like a signature. I thought of the things women mark without meaning to. Glasses, children, generations. Some stains come off, some don't. A week later, my routine was no longer mine. Elena ordered groceries online. Packages arrived with her name on every label. The refrigerator filled with brands I couldn't pronounce. When I offered to help with cooking, she said kindly, "Oh no, Mom, you relax. We've got this." The word mom sounded borrowed, like a word she used to play family, not to mean it. Sometimes Mark worked late, and she would knock on my door with leftover takeout. "Don't worry about paying me back," she'd say, setting the container on my nightstand. The smell of curry or pasta lingered after she left, mixing with the faint scent of cleaning products. I ate in silence, my own kitchen 3 doors away, yet suddenly foreign territory. One evening, when the rain came heavy, I offered to pay the internet bill. Elena laughed. "Oh, Clara, that's sweet, but it's already on auto pay. From my account, technically. It's simpler this way." Simpler, that word again. I began to hate how easy everything sounded when someone else was taking control. The next Sunday, I made my biscuits again, just for comfort. The smell drifted through the house. Mark came into the kitchen, smiling like he used to when he was a boy. For a moment, the years peeled away. He took one, bit into it, nodded approvingly. But then he said, almost absently, Elena was saying we should redo this kitchen, make it more open, more modern, maybe even replace that old stove. My hand froze midair. That stove had been my partner through decades. Mark's birthday cakes, Daniel's last meal, the dinners that had carried us through Everleen month. "It still works," I said. He shrugged. "Sure, but she wants the house to look younger." Younger. I didn't answer. I just watched the butter melt on his plate and thought about the word's cruelty, how it can mean better when used by those who never lived through older. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked to the kitchen and found my teapot back on the far shelf again. I brought it down, polished the handle with a towel, and set it where it belonged. Right on the counter, beneath the small window facing the lilac bush. I poured hot water, watched the steam rise, and whispered to the quiet, "Not yet." For weeks, the air grew thicker. Mark's tone changed when he spoke to me. Less son, more landlord. "Mom, could you keep your things in your room? Elena likes a cleaner space." "Mom, don't worry about the groceries. Elena has it organized." Every kindness carried a small command. Every smile asked for compliance. But old houses remember the ones who built them. The floors still creaked for me. The locks still clicked in rhythm with my fingers. When Elena rearranged the furniture, the light looked wrong. I moved a lamp back to its corner after she left, a quiet rebellion. Then one evening, as I wiped the counter after dinner, I heard Mark's laugh through the thin wall of their room. Deep, careless. Elena's voice followed, low and amused. "Her money's just sitting." "There," Mark said. "Why let it rot?" The words reached me like a whisper carried through smoke. I stopped wiping. The rag hung heavy in my hand. The camera would linger here, my reflection in the kitchen window, faint but upright. The night outside is thick with rain, the room behind me small but steady. I didn't move for a long time. I just kept my eyes on that reflection, then slowly began to clean again. each stroke of the cloth measured, deliberate, the sound almost tender. Because sometimes silence is not surrender. It is the first breath before the storm remembers your name. The night after I heard Mark's voice through the wall, I sat at the kitchen table long after the house went quiet. The clock ticked softly, like a small animal breathing in the dark. Outside, rain pressed against the windows, steady and private. The words kept replaying. Her money's just sitting there. Why let it rot? It wasn't rage that filled me. Rage burns too fast. What came instead was a slow, heavy calm, a kind of understanding that moves in silence and doesn't leave. I turned the teapot on, the one Elena had pushed aside. Its handle was still warm from where my hand had polished it earlier. I poured the water, listened to the hiss, and let the steam rise against my face. That smell of black tea, faint and earthy, always steadied me. For a long time, I just sat there with both hands around the cup. I watched the ripples tremble every time the old refrigerator clicked on. The light from the window fell across the table, pale and silver. I could see the lines in my skin more clearly under it, the years folded into each one. When the tea cooled, I opened the drawer by the phone and took out my checkbook, the bank card, and an old spiral notebook filled with neat columns of numbers. I ran my finger down the last entry, $130,245. I had written it in pencil, just in case the future needed erasing. That was the moment I realized no one else would protect that number. No one else would remember what it had cost. I reached for the phone. It was the same beige handset I'd owned since before Mark left for college. The plastic had yellowed with time. The buttons clicked softly beneath my fingertips as I dialed the number printed on the back of the card. Each tone felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, like the sound of a key turning in a door that had been closed too long. The call connected. A young voice, professional but kind, filled my ear. "Thank you for calling National Bank. My name is Alyssa. How can I help you today?" I hesitated only a breath. Then I said, "Hello, Alyssa. I'd like to freeze my debit card immediately." "Of course, ma'am. Was your card lost or stolen?" The question hung there, gentle but sharp. I stared out the window at the rain-slick streetlight and answered, "Neither. It's just finally mine again." There was a small pause on the line, the kind people give when they sense something sacred, but don't know why. "I understand," she said softly. "Let's take care of that for you right now." Her fingers must have moved quickly across her keyboard because I heard the faint rhythm of clicks through the receiver. I imagined her in some bright cubicle far from my little kitchen, young, tidy, unaware that this wasn't just a transaction but a declaration. While she worked, I stared at my reflection in the dark window. My face looked older than I felt, but steadier than I'd ever been. For the first time in a long while, I didn't look like someone waiting to be considered. "All right," Alyssa said. "Your card has been frozen. No new charges can be made until you reactivate it. Would you like me to issue a new one?" "No, thank you," I said. "This one has already said everything it needed to." I heard her smile through the line. "I'll note that for you, Mrs. Hensley. Is there anything else I can do tonight?" I almost said no. Then, quietly, I added, "Could you also make sure no one but me has access to this account? No authorized users, no automatic transfers." "Absolutely. You're the only one listed, ma'am. Would you like a confirmation mailed to your address?" "Yes," I said. "Paper, please. I trust paper." When the call ended, I stayed seated, the phone still in my hand. The kitchen felt different, emptier but somehow wider. The air moved slower. I could hear the tick of the clock again, steady and real. It's strange how power doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it's just a dial tone ending, a sound that means something inside you has decided. I placed the phone back on its cradle and reached for my tea. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. The bitterness suited the night. I looked down at my hands resting on the table. They were small things, veined, lined, worn from years of scrubbing and stitching, but they still trembled with strength. Not anger, just readiness. I pulled the notebook closer and began to write beneath the last number. Call completed. Account secured. Nobody touches this but me. The act of writing it down made it true. When I finished, I closed the notebook and ran my palm over its cover. The paper was soft at the corners from use. I had filled every page of that book myself. Every sum, every subtraction, every plan for a future I was never sure would come. Now it will finally serve its purpose. I stood and rinsed my teacup, slow and careful. Each movement felt deliberate, part of a quiet ceremony. The plate in the sink caught the light from the window. A thin beam slid over the curve of the cup, the way sunlight sometimes finds a forgotten thing and blesses it without reason. As I dried the cup, I whispered to the empty room, "You'll be fine." I wasn't sure if I meant the cup, the money, or myself. The floor creaked behind me, old wood remembering my weight. I turned off the kitchen light and left only the porch. Lamp burning. Its reflection glowed faintly in the window, gold against the dark. I walked down the hall toward my room, each step slower than the last. I could hear the rain thinning, the storm almost done. At my doorway, I paused. The sound of distant laughter drifted from Mark and Elena's room. Soft, content, unaware. I didn't resent it. I just listened for a moment, then closed my door with the care of someone sealing away a chapter. Inside, the room smelled faintly of lavender and starch. I set the teapot on the dresser, next to my wedding photo. Daniel's face in the picture looked proud, peaceful. I touched the frame lightly. "Don't worry," I whispered. "I've got it now." The rain finally stopped. The night fell into stillness. And somewhere deep inside that stillness, a door I hadn't realized was open, quietly locked itself. The next morning began with a sound that no longer belonged in this house. Tires screeching on gravel, a door slamming hard enough to rattle the porch glass. I didn't turn. I was at the stove, folding eggs in a small pan, the teapot whispering beside me. The air smelled faintly of butter and rain. The footsteps came fast. Mark's voice cut through the hall before he even reached the kitchen. "Why would you block the card?" I didn't answer right away. I slid the eggs onto a plate, turned off the flame, and let the silence stretch between us. He stood in the doorway, his hair still wet, his face red with a kind of panic I recognized. Not fear of loss, but fear of being told no. "Mom, do you even understand what happened? Elena was at the mall. She couldn't pay for anything. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" I set the spatula down, folded the small towel by the sink, and looked at him. The boy who used to sit at this same table swinging his legs under the chair was gone. The man in front of me was a stranger wearing his eyes. "Because it wasn't yours," I said quietly. He blinked, as if I'd spoken another language. "What?" "The card. It wasn't yours." The silence after that was sharp enough to hear the clock ticking above the fridge. Each second seemed to land harder than the one before. He shook his head, ran a hand through his hair, and exhaled. "You're unbelievable, Mom. You live here for free, eat the food Elena buys, and then you freeze the only card we can use? Do you even think about anyone but yourself?" Free. That word lingered in the air, heavy and wrong. I reached for the dish rag hanging on the oven handle, a checkered one faded from years of washing, and began to dry my hands. The motion was slow, deliberate. That towel had been with me through decades of kitchens, from the tiny apartment where Mark took his first steps to this house that no longer felt like mine. Its pattern, red and white squares, reminded me of balance, of things that could still hold together if you tended them. I didn't answer him. I simply folded the towel in half and placed it neatly on the counter. He scoffed, frustrated by my silence. "You know what? This is exactly the problem. You think just because you used to pay for things, you can control everything. But times change. Elena's the one managing the finances now. You should be grateful she even tries." Grateful. There it was again. The leash disguised as virtue. I turned, finally meeting his eyes. "Managing," I said softly. "Is that what you call it?" He stepped closer, hands clenched at his sides. "You're twisting everything. We were just trying to help you. You hoard money and then you act like we're stealing when we try to make this house better." My voice didn't rise. "Better for who?" He looked away, jaw tight. His silence was louder than shouting. I could feel my heartbeat, slow and steady, like a drum underwater. The kitchen felt smaller, the air thick with the scent of cooling tea. "Mom," he said finally, his tone shifting to something almost pleading. "Elena didn't mean any harm, she just thought—" I cut in gently. "I know what she thought, and I know what you did." His eyes darted toward the table, the one I'd bought secondhand when he started school. The edges were worn smooth by our meals, our laughter, our arguments. He used to sit there with Daniel, carving initials into the underside when he thought I wasn't looking. Now that same table separated us like a witness. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely. The weight of the moment wasn't in what I said, it was in what I didn't. He paced, rubbing his forehead. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. It was just one purchase, all right? We were going to pay you back." "With what? Respect? Because I've been waiting for that kind of payment for a while." He froze. The clock ticked again. I could tell he wanted to argue, to explain, to fill the silence with words that might sound like truth. But the thing about silence is that it exposes everything. It doesn't let lies breathe. So we stood there in the kitchen that had once been home, the air thick with unspoken sentences. Finally, I reached for the teapot. It hissed softly, as if sighing for us both. I poured the tea into my cup, steady hand, careful pour. The sound of liquid meeting porcelain was the only thing alive between us. I lifted the cup and spoke so quietly that he had to lean forward to hear. "You can't take what was built from my hunger." He stared at me, unsure whether it was anger or sadness that trembled in his chest. I didn't clarify. Some truths aren't meant to be softened. I took a sip, the warmth running through me like memory. Then I turned away and placed the cup on the table, the same way I used to place his breakfast when he was a boy, running late for school. Behind me, his breath faltered. I heard the faint creak of floorboards as he shifted his weight. "Mom," he said finally, voice lower, "you make it sound like I've done something unforgivable." I didn't look back. "No," I said, almost kindly. "You've done something forgettable. That's worse." He exhaled hard, muttered something I couldn't hear, and left the room. The doorframe caught the sound of his footsteps. Quick, uneven, retreating. When the quiet returned, I placed the towel back on its hook. The light from the window fell across the kitchen counter, catching on the steam rising from my cup. I stood there for a while, watching the tendrils of vapor fade into nothing. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't triumphant either. It felt more like standing at the end of a long shift, knowing the work was done and no one had noticed. But it mattered anyway. In the hallway, I heard Elena's voice, sharp and accusing, asking what had happened. Mark didn't answer. Doors closed. The house settled. I rinsed my cup, wrung the towel, and folded it once more, neat and square. The cotton was damp, warm against my palms. I pressed it to my face, breathed in the faint scent of soap, and felt something loosen inside me. For years, I had mistaken silence for weakness. Now I understood. It was simply space. Room to think, room to move. The clock ticked again, steady and calm. I looked at it, then at the teapot cooling on the stove. A thin beam of sunlight cut through the clouds outside and fell right across the cup, lighting it up like something sacred. I reached for it again, took one last sip, and whispered, not for him, not for anyone else, but for myself. "You can't take what was built from my hunger." The words settled in the air like dust after a storm, soft, weightless, undeniable. The following Sunday, I went to church. It wasn't habit as much as instinct. When the world tilted too sharply, I found myself walking toward the sound of the bells. The air smelled faintly of wax and old hymn books, and the stained glass light painted the pews in soft, fractured colors. That was where I saw June Morales. She'd been a music teacher before retiring, a small woman with gray curls and hands that always looked like they were ready to conduct a choir. I'd seen her around the parish before, always sitting in the same corner, humming quietly to herself. That morning she turned and caught my eye. "Clara," she said, smiling the way people smile when they already know your sadness. "You look like someone who needs strong coffee after Mass." We ended up at a small diner down the street. one of those places that smelled of bacon grease and maple syrup no matter what hour it was. We took the booth by the window, two women with decades folded into our faces, the kind who don't need to fill silence to understand it. For a while, we just stirred our cups, watching the cream spiral. Then June said softly, "You've been quiet lately. I can see it around your eyes." I hesitated. I wasn't sure where to start or how much to tell, but with June, words seemed to find their own way out. "My son," I said, "he and his wife, they used my savings, tried to." June didn't look shocked. She only nodded, slow and knowing. "Ah," she said, "so it's your turn." "My turn?" She smiled without humor. "We all have one, Clara. The moment when the people we built our lives around forget we're still alive inside them." Her words landed like truth long overdue. She told me her story in that same steady tone teachers use when the lesson is too painful to sugarcoat. Years ago, her son David had borrowed against her house to pay off gambling debts. She co-signed without reading the fine print, trusting him because trust was the language of motherhood. When he defaulted, she lost the house she'd lived in for 40 years. "I slept on my sister's couch for 2 years, she said, sipping her coffee. "You'd be surprised how much silence you can fit into one small room." I watched the light shift across her face, soft, resolute. She didn't look broken. She looked like someone who had rebuilt herself from smaller pieces and decided they fit better this way. "What did you do?" I asked. "I forgave him," she said, stirring her cup again, "but I never moved back." There was a pause. The waitress came by, refilled our cups. The clink of ceramic sounded almost holy in that quiet space. "Forgiving isn't the same as staying," June said, almost to herself. I let the words sit there. Outside the window, a mother walked by with her toddler, their hands locked tight together. I remembered when Mark's hand used to fit in mine like that, small, trusting, weightless. "Forgiving isn't the same as staying," I repeated. "Then maybe it's time I start leaving." June looked up sharply, a smile flickering in her eyes. "Maybe it is." We sat there, two women at the far edge of middle age, realizing there might still be chapters left. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was paper-thin but steady, her touch full of quiet understanding. "The hardest part," she said, "is believing you still get to have a future after you've been used up." "I don't feel used up," I said. "I feel..." Paused. She laughed softly. "Then hit play, sweetheart." Her words sounded lighter than they should have, but they carried a weight that settled deep in me. After we finished our coffee, she insisted on walking with me home. The day had turned bright, and the sun made the sidewalks glisten where the morning rain had dried. June carried an umbrella she didn't need, twirling it absently like a baton. When we reached my gate, she stopped and looked at the house. "Pretty," she said, "but it feels heavy." I nodded. "It is." June tilted her head. "You ever notice how some walls remember too much?" "I do now," she smiled. "Then maybe start building new ones that don't echo." After she left, I stood by the mailbox for a long while, watching her walk down the street until she disappeared behind the corner store. The sound of her shoes on the pavement, steady, rhythmic, lingered like a heartbeat after music ends. Inside, the house felt as she'd described, heavy, the curtains drawn just a little too tight, the air thick with the scent of furniture polish and unspoken tension. Mark and Elena weren't home. They had gone to brunch with friends, the kind of outing that used to include me when they needed someone to cover the bill. I poured myself a cup of tea, using the old ivory teapot again. The steam curled against the window pane, tracing fleeting patterns before fading. June's voice echoed in my mind. "Forgiving isn't the same as staying." I carried my cup to the dining room and sat in the chair I'd always chosen, the one slightly off-center, where I could see the entire room but never the front door. From there, I could almost pretend I still belonged. The table was spotless, but it no longer felt like mine. Elena's decorative runner lay across the middle, embroidered with gold thread. It looked expensive and cold. I set my cup on the wooden surface and traced the grain with my fingers, remembering every scratch that told our story. Mark's school projects, Daniel's old typewriter, my sewing machine humming late into the night. Each marks a memory. Each memory is a reminder of how invisible I'd become in the house I helped build. Outside, the wind rattled the window frames. Somewhere, a dog barked. Inside, everything waited, motionless, listening. I stood, walked to the living room, and looked at the family photo hanging above the fireplace. It was from Mark's wedding day. Elena's smile gleamed like glass. Mine looked rehearsed. I hadn't seen it that way before. Now it was obvious. The woman in that picture was already fading, already beginning to disappear into the background. June's words returned steady and final. Hit play. I turned away from the photo, went to my room, and opened the small dresser drawer where I kept my notebook. My hands didn't shake as I took it out this time. The list of numbers waited like an unfinished song. I added a line beneath the last entry, "Begin again." The words looked strange, almost foreign, but something in me recognized them. Later that evening, June called. Her voice was warm, full of that gentle humor that comes from having survived her own storms. "Are you still thinking about leaving?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "For the first time, it doesn't sound like running. It sounds like walking home." She laughed. "That's how you know you're ready." When the call ended, I sat in the dark, the phone still warm in my hand. For the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped by silence. I felt surrounded by possibility. The teapot whistled softly from the kitchen, calling me back. I poured one more cup and carried it to the porch. The evening air was cool, almost tender. Somewhere down the street, church bells began to ring again, low, steady, like a heartbeat I'd forgotten was mine. And I whispered, "Forgiving isn't the same as staying." The words didn't hurt anymore. They sounded like a door opening. That night, the house slept heavily. From the hallway came the muffled hum of the television in Mark and Elena's room, the faint rhythm of laughter canned into reruns. I sat at my desk under the yellow glow of a single lamp, the air dense with the scent of dust and tea leaves. The shadows trembled on the wall like memories too tired to hide. I opened the drawer and laid out what mattered most. The ivory teapot, hairline crack glinting faintly under the light. The checkered dish towel, folded square, still faintly warm from the last wash. A photo. Mark at 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning beside Daniel, both of them holding up a crooked kite that refused to fly. A small envelope of documents, my birth certificate, pension papers, and the deed that still carried my name. Everything else could stay. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street lamp outside the window drew a pale stripe across the floor, dividing the room in half, past on one side, future on the other. I began to pack slowly, almost reverently. My suitcase was old but clean, the zipper whispering open like an invitation. I rolled each item with care, the way I used to fold Mark's school uniforms. Habit, muscle memory, love, and caution all tangled together. Every movement felt final but not desperate. I wasn't running, I was preparing. There's a difference. The clock on the dresser clicked toward midnight. I reached for a pen, smoothed a sheet of paper across the desk, and began to write. The pen's tip scratched softly, deliberate and sure, like the sound of my own pulse finding its rhythm again. "Mark, I'm not angry, just done. I wish you both good things, safety, kindness, and enough quiet to hear your own hearts again. I hope one day you understand that everything you have was built on someone's hours, not luck. Mine were the hours that raised you. Take care of yourself, Mom." When I finished, I placed the note under the sugar bowl on the kitchen table, the same table where everything had once begun. The house was utterly still now. Even the refrigerator hum seemed softer, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then came the twist, quiet but decisive. I reached for the phone, dialed the same bank number from before. The night clerk recognized my name. "Mrs. Hensley, good evening," he said politely. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," I replied. "Just one more thing. I'd like to open a new account." There was a pause, the clicking of keys. "Of course. Do you want it linked to your existing account?" "No," I said gently. "Completely separate." He read me the details, his voice professional and calm, unaware that every word he spoke was building the foundation of my new life. When the paperwork was ready, I gave the final instruction. I'd like to transfer the entire balance, every cent from my current account into this one. Today. He hesitated just long enough to ask, "Are you sure, ma'am?" "I've never been more sure." The soft tapping of his keyboard filled the silence like distant rain. "All done," he said finally. "Would you like a new debit card mailed to the same address?" "No, I'll pick it up in person." When the call ended, I sat for a moment staring at the quiet phone. It glowed faintly in the dark, as if it knew what had just shifted. It wasn't about the money. It was about the right to decide where it lived. I opened the window, letting in a stream of cool night air. The wind carried the faint smell of lilac from the bush outside. For the first time in months, I could breathe without flinching. My reflection in the glass looked older than it had that morning, but stronger too. The gray in my hair shimmered like silver threads. I touched the line of my jaw, the same way I used to test fabric texture between my fingers, and thought, "This will do." I zipped the suitcase closed, the sound crisp and final. I placed the teapot carefully inside a padded wrap, the towel around it like a promise. The photo went on top. I left the lamp burning, just one small light for the past to keep. Before heading to bed, I walked through each room once more. The kitchen, spotless. The hallway, quiet. The living room, too curated, too clean, too much Elena. The family photo above the fireplace caught the lamplight. I stepped closer, looked at my own face in it, then turned the frame gently around so that the back faced outward. I didn't want to erase the memory, just pause it. In the silence, the clock struck 1. I poured myself one last cup of tea. The flavor was faintly bitter, the kind that lingers but doesn't wound. I whispered to the empty air, "You were a good home once." Then I washed the cup, dried it with the same checkered towel, and set it neatly beside the sink. As I turned off the light, I looked toward the window again. The street was empty, but the world outside no longer looked hostile. It looked possible. I left my packed suitcase by the door. Tomorrow, I would take a bus to the next town. June had already given me the name of a small apartment complex near her sister's. Affordable, quiet, close to a library. It sounded like peace. In the dark, I lay down, listening to the creaks of the house that no longer owed me anything. The wood and walls seemed to exhale, as if releasing me, too. My last thought before sleep was not sadness, but relief. The story of my life had always been told in small gestures, folding, washing, saving, enduring, but tonight it was written in motion, steady, calm, irreversible. Dawn arrived in a hush, the kind that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. A thin veil of mist hung over the street, softening every edge. The trees, the rooftops, even the worn path leading from my porch to the gate. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and the ghost of rain. I woke before the alarm, as if my body already knew it was time. The room was still gray with sleep, but I moved without hesitation. My suitcase sat by the door, zipped and waiting, the handle angled toward the world. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle one last time. The faucet hissed quietly, echoing against the tile. As the water heated, I stood by the window, watching the fog curl over the lilac bush outside. Drops of dew clung to its petals like small blessings. When the kettle began to sing, I reached for the ivory teapot, its surface warm beneath my fingertips. The familiar weight steadied me. I measured the leaves with care, as though it mattered more than ever to get it right. This wasn't just another cup of tea. It was a ritual of farewell. The steam rose in slow ribbons, tracing invisible shapes in the pale morning light. I sat at the table where so much had been spoken, and even more had been swallowed in silence. The wooden surface gleamed faintly under the soft light from the window. Beside my teacup, I placed a small ring of metal, my house keys, and the folded note I had written the night before. The sugar bowl, holding the letter in place, looked peaceful there, as if it had found its purpose. I took a sip. The tea was neither sweet nor bitter, just honest. Outside, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the quiet. The taxi had arrived, but I didn't rush. I let the moment linger, allowing each breath to register like a closing chapter. I stood, tucked the checkered towel gently into the pocket of my coat, and carried the teapot to my bag. It fit snugly beside the photo and documents. The small suitcase didn't look like much, but inside it was everything that was mine in truth. Proof that life doesn't need to be loud to be full. When I stepped outside, the mist kissed my face, cool and forgiving. The house looked softer in the early light, its edges blurred as if trying to hide its own guilt. At the edge of the yard stood Mr. Fred, my neighbor for nearly 20 years. He was leaning on his fence, wearing the same brown cardigan he wore every morning to fetch the newspaper. His small dog yapped at his feet, more curious than protective. He lifted his chin when he saw me. "Going somewhere, Miss Clara?" I smiled. "Home." He squinted, puzzled at first, then nodded slowly, understanding more than I'd said. "Well," he said, "safe travels then. The world's still got good corners left if you know where to stand." "I believe that," I told him. He smiled back, eyes kind, and tapped his paper against the fence. "I'll keep an eye on the place till someone new comes along." Thanked him, meaning it. Mr. Fred was one of those men who lived by decency rather than drama, and his presence alone made leaving easier. The driver, a young woman with sleepy eyes, stepped out to load my suitcase. "Morning, ma'am," she said, voice low but pleasant. "Where to?" I hesitated for half a second before giving her the address. June's sister's complex, 2 towns over. Saying it out loud made it feel real. As I settled into the back seat, the engine hummed softly, almost apologetic in its intrusion. Through the window, I saw the faint outline of my house fade behind the fog. For a moment, guilt tried to creep in, small and familiar, but I breathed it out with the mist. Some houses only stay alive by swallowing the people inside them. I had simply refused to be another name carved into its quiet walls. The taxi turned the corner. I caught the last glimpse of the porch light still burning, its glow fragile but steady. I'd left it on purpose, just enough warmth to say goodbye without invitation. The ride was silent except for the hum of the tires against the wet road. Fields rolled past, pale and endless, the mist thinning as the sun began to reach through. I watched it all without blinking, memorizing how freedom looked when it first woke up. My hand rested on my purse, feeling the rounded shape of the teapot through the fabric. That small, fragile thing had survived every kitchen I'd ever known, every storm, every disappointment. It wasn't worth much in money, but it was worth everything in meaning. It was proof that something could break and still hold water. I thought of June's voice, steady, amused, unflinching. Forgiving isn't the same as staying. She had been right. Leaving wasn't an act of anger. It was the quietest form of clarity. The driver glanced at me through the mirror. "Are you moving or visiting, ma'am?" "Moving," I said. "At least I think so." She smiled faintly. "Good morning. The roads are clear." "Yes," I said, my voice soft but sure. "They finally are." The sun broke through the clouds just then, painting the windshield in gold. The mist lifted like a curtain, revealing the stretch of road ahead. Clean, open, and waiting. I let my fingers tighten around the bag one last time. Inside, the teapot shifted slightly, a small weight against my palm, like a heartbeat answering my own. I wasn't leaving behind wealth or glory, just rooms filled with echoes that no longer needed me, and in return, I carried with me something better, peace, and the quiet knowledge that what I'd built from love and hunger couldn't be stolen, only misunderstood. As the taxi climbed the small hill at the edge of town, the driver reached for the radio. Music filled the space between us. Soft piano, a tune both melancholy and light. It suited the morning perfectly, neither mourning nor celebration, just truth. I looked out the window. The fog was gone now, replaced by sunlight trembling over the wet fields. Birds darted across the sky, tiny and certain in their direction. The town disappeared behind us. Ahead, the road stretched into brightness. I took one last deep breath, tasting the morning, and whispered to myself, not as goodbye, but as beginning. Home. The apartment June found for me sat by the river, a modest brick building with peeling paint and a view of water that caught every bit of morning sun. It wasn't grand, it wasn't meant to be. But the first time I saw it, something deep inside me said, "This will do." June met me there with her sister's old station wagon packed with boxes. "It's not fancy," she said, handing me the key, "but it's yours." The metal felt cool against my palm, ordinary, unremarkable. Yet when I slid it into the lock and turned, it made a sound I'd never heard before, a door opening that belonged only to me. The hinges creaked softly, and the sunlight poured through the small front window like it had been waiting for this moment. The air smelled faintly of plaster and rain. Dust floated lazily, catching the gold light as if celebrating. June stepped aside, smiling. "Well, look at that. Feels like the place has been holding its breath for you." I took my first step inside. The floorboards groaned under my shoes, not in complaint, but in greeting. The space was small, one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a window that overlooked the riverbank, but to me, it was endless. There was no television, no photographs on the walls, no sound except for the steady hum of the world outside. Birds, wind, a boat horn echoing from far away. June set down the box she'd carried. "You'll need curtains," she said, "and a proper chair for that view. Maybe a little table by the window, perfect for your tea." I smiled. "You already know me too well." She grinned, "Only because I'm the same." When she left, promising to return later with groceries, the apartment fell into silence again. But this silence was different. It didn't press or accuse. It simply existed. I unpacked slowly, a photo for the nightstand, a folded towel for the kitchen, the ivory teapot unwrapped and placed carefully on the counter near the window. The faucet groaned when I turned it, coughing out water that smelled faintly of metal. I filled the kettle anyway, setting it on the stove and striking a match. The flame caught, steady and blue. While I waited, I walked to the window. The river shimmered below, quiet but alive. A single heron stood near the reeds, patient as a priest. Beyond it, the water stretched toward the horizon like a promise too vast to name. When the kettle began to whistle, I poured the water into the teapot and sat by the window. The cup in my hand steamed softly, and I let myself breathe. The first exhale came shaky, the second steadier, the third deep enough to reach the years I had kept buried under obedience. "Freedom," I whispered, lifting the cup. "Smells like dust and sunlight." The tea tasted different here, less bitter, more alive. Maybe because the air didn't belong to anyone else. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to whisper when I poured. I looked around the room at the boxes stacked neatly by the wall and felt a surprising calm. I had thought starting over at 63 would feel like failure. Instead, it felt like forgiveness. Later that afternoon, June returned with a potted fern, a bag of groceries, and a small grin. "A housewarming gift," she said, setting the plant on the sill. "Something green that doesn't judge you if you forget to water it." I laughed. A real laugh. Not the kind you use to make others comfortable. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, "but you deserve something that grows just for you." We sat together on the floor, drinking tea from mismatched mugs. She looked around, nodding with satisfaction. "You did this," she said, "all by yourself." "I suppose I did." She leaned back against the wall. "You know, Clara, there'll be people who say you should have told your son, that you owed him that." I looked down at my cup, the steam still rising. Maybe, but every time I told him something, it became his. This one's mine. June nodded slowly, and that's reason enough. That night, after she left, I sat on the small balcony overlooking the water. The sky turned lavender, and the first lights from town began to flicker across the river. I could hear faint laughter from people walking on the far bank. Unfamiliar, yet oddly comforting. Inside, the apartment smelled of warm tea and new beginnings. I had unpacked the last of my things, the checkered towel, now folded neatly beside the sink, and the family photo placed face down in a drawer. Not out of anger, but because the past no longer needed to sit on my shelf. I opened the small notebook where I'd tracked my savings for decades. The numbers were tidy, calm. The balance from the new account sat at the bottom of the page, untouched, waiting. I picked up the pen and wrote beneath it, "New home purchased, funds secure." The ink bled slightly into the paper fibers. I watched it spread and thought how even small marks can change a whole page. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the ache in my chest that came with every decision. There was no one to please, no one to convince, only space. Still, I could almost hear the future arguments, voices from nowhere but the conscience shaped by motherhood. "You should have told him, Clara. He's your son. Maybe you went too far. Maybe this was too cold." But another voice, the one I'd ignored for too long, answered quietly, "He's a man now, and you are still a woman. You get to have your own life, too." I smiled to myself, setting the notebook aside. In the dim light, the teapot gleamed softly. I reached over, traced the hairline crack with my finger. It felt like a map, one that led back to every place I'd survived. The next morning, the light would hit the water again, and I would wake to it without guilt. The sun would rise over the river, not over a house that mistook my silence for weakness. Maybe one day Mark would call. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, I'd answer in kindness, not surrender, because the truth was simple and heavy and clean. I hadn't disappeared. I had just changed address. The wind off the river stirred the curtains, brushing against my shoulder. I took it as a blessing, the quiet kind. It happened 2 weeks after I moved. The day was quiet, a soft breeze off the river brushing through the curtains. I was kneeling beside the small bookshelf I'd bought secondhand, arranging my few favorite novels by height rather than author, when the knock came. 3 short raps, hesitant but firm. At first, I thought it might be June, stopping by with more tea leaves or one of her famous peach scones. But something in the rhythm, the pause between each knock, stirred a deeper memory. I stood, wiped my hands on my apron, and turned toward the door. Through the frosted glass, a familiar silhouette blurred against the morning light. Broad shoulders, restless stance. Mark. For a moment, my heart stumbled, not in fear, but in recognition of something I had already released. The cat I'd adopted from the shelter, a quiet gray thing I'd named Milo, sat by the window, tail flicking. His pupils widened, reflecting the moving shadow on the other side of the door. In his eyes, I saw both of us, me standing still and Mark shifting, impatient. Another knock, louder this time. I opened the door halfway. The chain latch stopped it, leaving just enough space for air and words to pass through. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying the fatigue of anger held too long. "So, it's true. You really left." I met his eyes. "Yes." He exhaled hard, rubbing the back of his neck. "You couldn't even tell me? You couldn't wait a few days before disappearing?" "I didn't disappear," I said softly. "I moved." His jaw tightened. "You broke our family." The words hung there, sharp and practiced, like something he'd rehearsed on the way over. I didn't flinch. I'd heard that line before, in different forms, in different rooms. It was the anthem of guilt disguised as grief. "No," I said finally. My voice came out calm, steady, older than the walls around us. "You broke the respect. I just stopped sweeping up the pieces." For a moment, he looked stunned, as if I'd spoken in a language he'd never learned. Then his expression hardened. "You're being cruel. Elena's been sick about this. She said you froze the accounts, drained everything. You made us look like thieves." I watched him, the boy who once came to me crying over a scraped knee, now furious over losing control. "I didn't make you look like anything," I said. "You did that yourselves." His nostrils flared. "You think you can just walk away from us? From your son?" "I'm not walking away," I said. "I'm standing where I should have stood all along." The sunlight shifted, landing squarely across his face. For a brief second, I saw the young man he once was, the one who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them sun gifts. But that boy was gone, replaced by someone who measured love in ownership. He stepped closer, his voice rising. "You're unbelievable. You live off everything we've done for you, and now you're playing the victim?" I shook my head slowly. "Mark, I lived off my own hands for 40 years. Everything I gave you came from those hands, and now I'm using them for myself." He opened his mouth to argue, but I could see the cracks forming. The confusion, the resentment, the ache that comes when the story you built starts to collapse under its own weight. "Mom," he said again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Just come back home. We'll fix it." "I am home," I said. His eyes flicked past me, taking in the small apartment behind the door, the clean counters, the single chair, the teapot gleaming faintly on the stove. He looked at it all like it was an insult, not an achievement. "This?" he said. "You left everything for this?" "Yes," I answered, "because this doesn't ask me to apologize for existing." He stared at me, speechless. The silence stretched long enough to feel like a wall between us. "Please," he said finally, "don't do this." But I already had. I stood straighter, my hand still resting on the doorframe. "You'll be fine," I said. "You and Elena, you have your lives. I have mine." That's how families survive. When they stop pretending ownership is love. He blinked hard, like he didn't understand, like the words wouldn't fit into the shape of his world. "You've changed," he said. "I hope so." The cat moved then, brushing against my leg, its reflection catching in the glass again. Mark's eyes followed it, and for a fleeting instant I saw his face soften, confusion mixing with something close to sorrow. He lifted his hand, hesitated, then let it drop. "You really won't even let me in?" "No," I said gently. "Some doors stay closed so everyone can start breathing again." His voice cracked. "You're choosing a house over your family." I smiled faintly. "I'm choosing peace over noise. That's all." The conversation ended there. It had nowhere else to go. He looked away, muttered something I couldn't catch, and turned. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, quick, uneven, full of all the things he wasn't ready to hear. I didn't call after him. The camera would stay on me, one hand on the door, the chain latch still hooked, my posture straight but not rigid. Behind me, the apartment bathed in soft light. Before me, the corridor fading into shadow. As his figure disappeared, the sound of his voice still lingered faintly, bouncing off the walls, muffled, distant, already fading. I closed the door slowly, the latch clicking back into place with a sound that felt final but not cruel. For a long moment, I stood there, breathing in the quiet. My reflection stared back from the small hallway mirror. Older, yes, but alive in a way it hadn't been for years. Then I turned toward the kitchen. The teapot waited on the stove, its handle gleaming. I filled it with fresh water, set it over the flame, and watched as the first threads of steam began to rise. The sound of boiling grew louder, a steady hum that filled the silence he left behind. It wasn't angry. It wasn't mournful. It was alive, steady, unshaken, certain. I leaned on the counter, listening. The kettle began to whistle, soft at first, then clearer, the sound unfurling like breath, returning to lungs. And as the camera pulled back, the world outside blurred, his footsteps gone, the river glinting through the window, the teapot whistling on. The days began to soften into something that finally felt like living. I learned the rhythm of this new town the way a person learns a song from childhood they'd forgotten they knew, slowly, but with recognition in every note. Each morning I opened the curtains wide, letting the sunlight pour across the kitchen tiles. The river outside gleamed in different moods, silver when the day began, gold by afternoon, and deep blue at dusk. I'd brew my tea, the ivory teapot breathing steam, and stand there with both hands wrapped around the cup. The sound of the water, the faint hum of the city waking, it all blended into a quiet kind of joy. I started going to the market on Thursdays. The vendors soon learned my name. There was the man who sold peaches and insisted I take the ripest ones for luck, and the florist who slipped extra lavender into my bag. Simple kindnesses, the kind that don't require explanation. Sometimes I'd see women my age walking together, shopping lists folded in their hands, laughter spilling behind them like breadcrumbs. I used to feel apart from that kind of ease. Now I walked among them, not the same, but near enough. On Fridays, I joined June at the small knitting class she attended at the community hall. My hands weren't used to the rhythm at first. They fumbled through the loops and yarn, clumsy and slow. But June only chuckled. "Every stitch forgives the one before it," she said. "That's the secret." The room always smelled faintly of wool and peppermint tea. The women there talked about their grandchildren, their gardens, their small aches. I listened more than I spoke, but sometimes, when the talk turned to sons or money or what forgiveness should look like, I'd lift my eyes and meet June's. She'd give me that look, the one that said, "I know." On Sundays, we went to church together, always sitting near the same window where the light made halos on the pews. I used to come to church out of habit. Now I came because I liked the silence before the hymns began. The choir's voices would rise and fill the air, and I'd think, this is what survival sounds like when it's sung instead of spoken. After service, June and I often shared tea at her apartment. She lived 2 floors below mine, in a cozy place filled with music sheets and old frame photos of her students. The air there always smelled of cinnamon and clean laundry. One afternoon, the 2 of us sat by her window watching the rain streak down the glass. She was knitting another scarf, the yarn pale blue this time. I was tracing the rim of my teacup, lost in thought. June looked up from her needles. "You're quieter than usual," she said. "That's saying something." I smiled faintly. "Just thinking." "About him?" "Not exactly," I said. "About what came before him?" She tilted her head. "Tell me." I hesitated, then took a slow sip of tea before setting the cup down. The truth had been sitting in me for years, tucked away like a letter I never mailed. Maybe it was time. "When Mark got married," I began, "he wanted to buy a house. He and Elena had found one, knew too big too soon, but they wanted it anyway. He said they couldn't afford the down payment. I didn't think twice. I sold my first house." June's hands stilled. "You what?" "The little white one on Maple Street," I said quietly. "The one Daniel and I bought when Mark was born. I sold it and gave him every dollar. I told him it was a gift, but I thought of it as an investment in his future. He never knew what I gave up to make it happen." June's knitting needles rested on her lap. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes soft but sharp with understanding. "Does he know now?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, and I don't think he ever will." The rain tapped harder against the window, filling the silence between us. "I kept a copy of the deed," I said. "Sometimes I take it out just to remind myself that I really did it, that it wasn't a dream." June leaned back, sighing. "You carried that alone all these years?" "I didn't see the point in telling anyone, say," I said. "It wasn't a story that made sense outside of love." She looked at me the way a teacher looks at a student who said something truer than the lesson itself. "Then you didn't lose money, Clara," she said softly. "You invested in a lesson." The words struck deep, but they didn't hurt. They landed like light. I smiled, half to her, half to myself. "A very expensive one." June chuckled, setting her knitting aside. "The best ones usually are." We sat there in a comfortable quiet, watching the rain ease into mist. That evening, I walked home along the riverside path. The street lamps glowed against the damp pavement, and the air carried the scent of wet grass. I thought about what June had said, about lessons, about worth. For so long, I had measured my life in what I gave away. But maybe giving wasn't losing. Maybe it was planting, and the harvest just took longer than anyone expected. When I reached my apartment, I lit the small lamp on the counter and filled the kettle. The sound of water running still gave me peace. I set the ivory teapot on the stove and watched the flame catch. As I waited for it to boil, I noticed something I hadn't before, the reflection of myself in the window. My posture was straighter, my face softer. The woman looking back at me didn't seem lost. She seemed present. The kettle whistled, steady and sure. I poured the tea, carried it to the small balcony, and sat down in the evening light. The river below shimmered gold, the kind of glow that looks like forgiveness itself. Milo the cat jumped onto my lap, curling against the warmth. I stroked his fur, feeling the small pulse beneath his ribs. "Lesson learned," I whispered. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. I listened to them fade, then took a sip of tea, breathing in the faint scent of dust and sunlight. My life wasn't large, but it was mine, stitched together from work and memory and a quiet resilience that no one could ever claim again. It arrived on a Wednesday morning. The mail usually came quietly, a soft thump against the floor of the corridor outside my apartment. That day, it sounded different, heavier, as if the envelope carried more than paper. I found it lying just inside my door. My name was written across the front in a hand I hadn't seen in months. Firm strokes, rushed edges, the kind of handwriting that used to fill my refrigerator with "Love you, Mom" notes written in marker. Now it simply said, Clara Hensley. No return address, but I didn't need one. The way the sea dipped too low, the way the ink smudged near the corner, it was his. I stood there for a moment, holding it between my fingers, feeling the faint tremor that comes when the past decides to knock again. Then I set it on the table beside the ivory teapot, made myself a cup of tea, and sat down before opening it. The paper inside was creased, folded twice. The first line was simple, almost bare. "Mom, Elena's gone." I read it once, then again. No explanation followed, just the words, small and blunt, sitting in the white space like a confession. He continued, "She left last month, said she needed to start over. I guess I can't blame her. I know I've done things that can't be undone. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." There was no plea, no question, not even a phone number. Just that one line, "I'm sorry." I sat back in my chair, the letter resting open on the table. The river breeze drifted through the window, stirring the edges of the paper. Outside, children were laughing somewhere near the water. Life, as always, kept moving forward. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel. Pity? Relief? Some final triumph? None of it fit. What came instead was something quieter, deeper. An ache that wasn't pain anymore, just understanding. People don't break all at once. They drift. They choose small silences until they forget the sound of love. I had done it too, in my own way, staying silent for too many years while pretending everything was fine. But now, silence meant something else. It meant peace. I reread his letter, noticing how the ink faded slightly near the end, as if he had stopped to think too long before signing his name. Love, Mark, that word, love, had traveled a long way to reach me again. I folded the paper carefully, smoothing the creases with my palm. Then I took out a blank sheet from the drawer, the same kind I'd used for my note to him months ago. The pen felt light in my hand this time. I didn't have to search for words. They were already waiting. "Mark, I hope you find yourself, son." I already did. "Mom?" That was all. No more, no less. I placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote his name on the front. Steady, deliberate, unshaken. When I was finished, I set it on the counter beside the teapot to take to the post office later. The clock ticked softly behind me, and the kettle began to hum again, a sound that had come to mean comfort rather than duty. I thought about calling him, about hearing his voice, older now, maybe cracked with regret. But I knew if I did, he'd fill the silence with explanations, and explanations have a way of stealing the truth. So I didn't call. Instead, I let the silence do the talking. I walked out to the balcony with my cup of tea and watched the river bend in the distance. The afternoon sun shimmered across the water like scattered coins. Somewhere beyond that horizon was the boy I'd raised, now a man learning his own lessons. And somewhere on this side stood a woman who had finally learned hers. I took a slow sip, breathing in the warmth. The wind tugged gently at my hair, lifting a few gray strands that caught the light like threads of silver. At that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't even feel sad. I just felt free. Because forgiveness, I realized, isn't a door you open for someone else. It's one you open to let yourself walk out. Later that evening, I walked to the post office just before closing. The air smelled of salt and lilacs. The clerk recognized me, smiled, and said, "Just the one letter today?" "Yes," I said, handing it over. "Just the one." He stamped it, slid it into the outgoing tray, and wished me a good night. As I walked home, I imagined the envelope traveling, carried by hands that didn't know our story, through machines that wouldn't care. And yet, somehow, I liked that. It made the act cleaner, simpler, no drama, no return, just a message released into the world, to find him when it was ready. When I returned home, the apartment was glowing with the last light of dusk. The cat stretched on the rug, lazy and content. I poured another cup of tea and sat by the window. The river was dark now, reflecting the first stars. I thought about Daniel, my late husband, and wondered what he'd make of all this. I imagined him smiling faintly, saying something like, "You finally stopped saving everyone else, Clara." And maybe I had. I set the teacup down and watched the steam curl upward, thin and weightless. There would always be a part of me that wished things had gone differently, that Mark had grown into the man his father believed he'd be. But love doesn't vanish when you stop holding it. It just changes shape. Now mine lived in small, steady things, in the quiet mornings, in the feel of the river wind, in the way I could breathe without apology. I took one last look at the letter on the counter, now gone to wherever letters go when they leave your hands. I didn't need to wait for an answer. Some stories end better when they echo in silence. A year can pass quietly when you stop counting the days. The seasons along the river learned to greet me like old friends. Winter came and went with its soft gray skies, and spring followed with green so tender it almost hurt to look at. By the time summer arrived, the sunlight had turned golden again, spilling through my window each morning like forgiveness made visible. That morning was no different. I sat in my small armchair by the window, the ivory teapot resting on the table beside me, steam rising in slow, delicate curls. The scent of jasmine filled the room. Outside, the river shimmered, a slow, breathing thing, moving as it pleased. Milo the cat stretched at my feet, half asleep, his ears twitching toward the rustle of the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 9 times. It had been exactly 1 year since I'd moved here, 1 year since the door closed behind me for the last time. I didn't keep a calendar anymore. Time no longer felt like something to manage. It was simply something to sit beside, to sip tea with. Most mornings, June would call to remind me about our knitting class or to gossip about the new choir director. But that morning, the phone stayed quiet. The world was in that rare kind of peace that asks for nothing. I poured myself another cup, watching the ripples spread on the tea's surface. That was when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps in the hall outside my door. Slow, uneven, hesitant. I thought it was the mailman at first, but then came the soft knock. 3 times, the same rhythm I had heard once before in another place, another life. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then I rose, walked to the door, and opened it. Mark. He looked different, thinner, older, the lines around his eyes deeper, the pride around his mouth quieter. He wasn't holding flowers or apologies, just a small brown box wrapped in paper. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice was lower than I remembered, not broken, just slower, as if he'd spent the year learning how to speak without filling the air with excuses. I nodded. "Hello, Mark." We stood there for a heartbeat too long. Then he lifted the box slightly, awkwardly. "It's for you." I stepped aside just enough for him to place it on the table near the door. He didn't try to come in. I didn't invite him. Some distances don't need to be bridged to mean something. When he set the box down, I saw the label, Earl Grey Reserve. A new blend, expensive, carefully chosen. His hands lingered on it for a moment before pulling back. "I saw it at the market," he said, his tone unsure. "Thought you might like it." I looked at the box, then at him. "Thank you." He nodded once, shoved his hands into his pockets, and for a moment I saw the boy he had been, the one who used to wait for me to pour his tea, who'd grin when I added too much honey. I reached for the teapot and poured 2 cups without asking. The sound of tea filling porcelain filled the silence between us, soft and steady. He watched, eyes following the familiar motion. After a moment, he smiled faintly, though it barely reached his eyes. "You used to pour mine first," he said. I placed his cup on the table, the steam drifting between us like breath. "Now you pour your own," I said, my voice gentle as a breeze through open curtains. He gave a small, rueful laugh, nodding once. "Fair enough." We both sat, the air between us fragile but not sharp. There were no speeches, no tears, just the steady clink of spoons and the quiet hum of the river outside. He sipped his tea, stared into the cup for a long while, then said quietly, "I moved out of the old house. It didn't feel right anymore." I nodded. Houses remember things. "Yeah." He took another sip. "I've been trying to fix a few things." "That's good," I said. "Fixing takes time." He looked at me then, really looked. "You seem happy." "I am," I said simply. The honesty of it seemed to take him by surprise. He nodded again, slow and thoughtful. After a long silence, he said, "You know, I used to think what you did was cruel." "I know. But now, I think maybe it was just honest." "It was necessary," I said. Honesty usually is. He leaned back, exhaling through his nose, as though the truth itself was both bitter and relieving. For a while, neither of us spoke. The river's murmur filled the pauses, and the kettle on the stove ticked softly as it cooled. Then, almost shyly, he said, "I still have that photo, the one of you and Dad with the kite. I keep it on the mantel." "I'm glad," I said. "He was a good man," Mark whispered. "He was," I agreed. "And you're still his son." He looked down, the faintest tremor in his hands. Then he finished his tea, set the cup aside, and stood. "I should go," he said. I rose too. "Take some of the new tea with you," I offered. He smiled, small, real. "No, Mom, this one's yours." He turned toward the door, hesitated just long enough to glance back. "You know," he said softly, "for what it's worth, I'm glad you found somewhere that feels like peace." "I hope you find yours too," I said. He nodded once more, then stepped out into the hall. The sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor, measured, unhurried. I closed the door gently, the latch clicking with quiet finality. The apartment felt neither empty nor full, just balanced, like breath between heartbeats. I walked back to the table, refilled my cup, and sat by the window again. The river glimmered beneath the afternoon sun, endless and calm. I took a sip and smiled faintly. Somewhere out there, life continued, unfolding, repairing, forgiving itself in quiet ways. I looked at the unopened box of tea still sitting where he had left it. I didn't move it right away. I liked seeing it there, a small token of something new, something not yet defined. Milo jumped onto the windowsill, curling beside the pot of lavender that June had given me months ago. The wind moved through the leaves, carrying the faint scent of earth and home. I whispered to the stillness, "Peace doesn't ask for permission. It just needs a door you finally close." The kettle on the stove began to hum again, a low, steady sound like a heartbeat finding its rhythm.